Thank you for joining us today for Cultivating, a marketplace of plug-and-play tools for student-centered learning. You may notice that your audio is muted, and it will remain so throughout today's event. Please use the Q&A to submit questions. I'm Jill Hobson, K-12 Institutional Program Manager for IMS Global, and let me introduce to you my colleague, Kara Jenkins, Marketing Communications Director. For those of you who may not be familiar with IMS Global, we're a nonprofit member collaborative. Our members include leading districts, state organizations, higher ed institutions, and educational technology suppliers working together to innovate and improve the EdTech ecosystem to enable better learning from better learning technology through plug-and-play integration, open architecture, and the assurances that come from IMS Global certification. Each member district has evolved their own unique strategy and approach based on their unique situation. Yet all of these districts are collaborating on the open IT and integrated curriculum architecture that enables this flexibility. And now let me welcome our guest speakers for today's webinar. We have with us Lenny Shad, Chief Information Technology Officer for Houston Independent School District in Texas, and also a member of the IMS Global Board of Directors. Leilani Kaufman, Chief Executive Officer of the Learning Council and a member of the IMS Executive Strategic Council. And Keith Krueger, Chief Executive Officer of the Consortium of School Networking, a partner with IMS Global. I'm going to ask each of our guests today to just give a brief introduction of themselves and tell a little bit about their background and experience and context for today's webinar. So if I could, let me just begin with Lenny and ask you to give a little introduction.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lenny Shad. I've been with the Houston Independent School District since January of 2013. And beginning that first year, we really started our digital transformation here in HISD, and it focused around our Power Up initiative, which was a program to give every high school student in our district a laptop to take home. And it was the beginning of this initiative that really started us down the interoperability path. We focused on how we were going to change instruction and leverage devices in 2013, but beginning in 2014, as we continued our rollout, we really started to focus on digital content and how we could make more of our resources available to our kids, and that was really our introduction into interoperability. And so HISD has really been heavily involved in IMS and the work IMS has done in this area of interoperability. And we no longer purchase textbooks for our high school students. We have over 2.5 million objects in our learning object repository. And so I would say we are, well along in this interoperability world, very familiar with the nuances, have great relationships with our publishers, have great relationships with our vendors, and what we found is it's really a three-legged milk stool. Districts can't do it by themselves, publishers can't do it, or content providers can't do it by themselves, and vendors can't do it by themselves. We all have to come together and understand one goal and figure out how each organization and what role they play in achieving that goal. And I think that's why IMS is such an important organization. They're kind of that middle layer that puts us all together. So we've been doing this since 2014, very excited where we're at and look forward to the future. Thank you.
And Leilani, could I ask you to give a brief introduction as well?
Sure. So we founded, or I founded, along with Dr. David Kavitz, who's a former superintendent, the Learning Council, about the same time as Lenny got on to his initiative, because being a member of the media for so many years and other organizations, I saw the need to bring research and context around what was going on inside digital curriculum. So that's sort of where I intersected with IMS Global as well. So the sophistication of digital courseware is becoming more and more interesting, both to the American public and to schools. What we've been tracking with now for the last several years as the Learning Council, through being in 26 to 30 some cities a year with our regional events, and then we always do a national event, is the fact that Americans are now spending almost $6 billion and more a year on direct purchase of digital courseware than all schools put together in America. So there's definitely a change on the horizon. It's bringing pressure into schools. So what Lenny has done is start to bring some real order to that, and I can talk about what I'm seeing in the rest of the cities that the Learning Council tours during the course of the year. But that gives you a little bit of context around who's Leilani Kaufman and what am I all about. The only other thing to know about me is that I wrote a book that went on Amazon and Barnes & Noble this year called The Consumerization of Learning, and it's about what's going on in digital courseware and this whole transition nationally.
And this is Keith Krueger. I'm CEO of CoSN. CoSN is the Consortium for School Networking. We've been around for 25 years, and we're a nonprofit professional association for school system or school district technology leaders. Lenny would be a poster child for us as the kind of person in school districts leading digital transformation efforts. I've been with the organization for 23 of its 25 years, so a long time, and I'm certainly not a technical expert, but I would say that when we've asked our audience, for over 20 years what their priorities are, the issue of interoperability has always been on the list of top 10 concerns. I would also say that's the optimistic half-full side of the cup. The half-empty side is that we never see it, or until recently, we haven't seen it bubbling up to kind of a top 3 issue where people are really taking action. So we think that's changing. We think this is a great time for this webinar and for a new conversation with district technology leaders around what they can do, not just to talk about it, but to actually make a difference.
Thanks, Keith. That's great. And a great lead-in to this discussion that we're going to have. And just to frame this up a little bit, we really want to talk about what's next on the horizon and how can we eliminate some of the havoc that has existed in the marketplace, and what kinds of collaboration and leadership are going to answer the need. I'm really going to turn it over to Lenny at this point, who will be moderating the conversation among the 3 of you. And I just want to say again, welcome and thank you to all of you for being here today.
Okay, Jill, thanks. Well, what I thought I would do is, since we're at the end of 2017, what I'd like to do is, from each of you, Keith and Leilani, just get your perspective on what you've seen over the course of 2017 as far as movement in this interoperability space. What are some of the good things that you've seen over this past year? Leilani, we'll start with you.
Okay, then. Well, the good things are that the top school districts in the country are all over this. They get it. They understand it. But to be really honest, I was in 28 cities this year, and I keynoted in a few other cities for other conferences. And as I'm leading our regional meetings, the fact is, I would say a good 80% of the school districts are not even really aware of this conversation. They're not at the maturity level to get it. 50% of the market, according to our big national survey, we surveyed 477 schools and districts. We just finished analyzing that in the last month. 50% of the school districts have gone straight up Google Docs and Google Class, which is, in my mind, a little bit of a recipe for total dispersal of records into madness. So, there's people that aren't really at the point where they're understanding digital courseware, and they don't understand systems leadership, which is what prompted the Learning Council to have on our discussion board for all of next year 2 areas. What is real systems leadership? And then secondly, what is analytics? What is it going to do, and how do you use it, and how do you do real onboarding to lead with systems? So that we're setting up basically the rest of the market to mature to the point where they can actually lead this conversation on a much deeper level. So I guess maybe the good news is that we see them on the trajectory to do that. They're getting there. The nation, according to our studies, is now at 85% saturation of devices in the classroom for a significant portion of the day. It might just be a laptop cart, it might be just BYOD in many places, but we're reaching market saturation. So that means everybody is face planted into software. And so as they face plant in and they get the mess happening with willy-nillyism all over the place, with teachers buying random apps and doing random things, and then schools doing random things and districts doing random things, they start to need this conversation because they realize, whoa, this is way more of a deep end of the pool than we thought we were in. So that maybe that's the good news.
Okay. Keith, what about you? From working with regional and national leaders, what are you seeing that were some good things that happened?
Well, I think we're making tremendous progress in kind of the moving to digital learning. So from that perspective, in terms of, as Leilani pointed out, devices, 20 years ago when we started talking about technology, the focus was digital divide, and it was mostly a conversation about devices. That certainly is not solved, but it's less and less of a problem. The big problem of today has been robust infrastructure, broadband access, both at school and outside of school. We're making great progress, I would say, because of the E-rate modernization at school. We have challenge. That's not to say that every school has that. Rural and remote are big problems. But the bottom line is learning has gone digital. And so, we do an annual leadership survey. Mobile learning for the first time was ranked as the #1 priority for our audience. Broadband capacity is the #2. And cybersecurity and privacy is #3. But I think we haven't yet, as Leilani pointed out, gotten to a very, very far yet on interoperability. We do a survey, the survey that I've just mentioned. We asked people, on some key topics like single sign-on. That was the most progress. We saw 20% of school district leaders, technology leaders, saying they had fully implemented a single sign-on solution. But when we go to things like content interoperability, only 5% of districts say that. When we talk about data interoperability fully implemented, only 8%. And when we look at data dashboards, only 10% said they were. So we're really at a moment where this problem of interoperability needs to be solved if we're going to really live in a digital learning environment.
Yeah, and I guess from a district perspective, some of the things that I've seen over the last year is, I've seen more of an awareness of the need for interoperability. I can remember 2 years ago giving presentations and having, 5 or 6 people in a room. And this past year, when we were giving presentations, the rooms were packed. And so I do think that there's an awareness, and, I think that there's an excitement around that. But, I'm gonna switch it a little bit to say, okay, what should we be focused on for next year? And, Keith, you and I have had this conversation over and over again. There's this impression that interoperability is this massive thing, this massive undertaking that you have to be an HISD to take on. And so I think that one of the things we have to do for next year is demystify interoperability and break it down into bite-sized chunks. So, it doesn't matter the size of your school system. You can understand how you can begin to enter into that. I'm curious to see from your perspective, and Leilani, yours as well, as you travel around, do you see this this demystification of interoperability as something that we should focus on, or do you think there are other things we should focus on?
Well,
I'll jump on.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Leon. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so, like, for example, we just put out this systems leadership versus the classroom, sort of a provocative way to say it. But, yeah, so you have to break things down to a simpler level to reach all the way into the superintendent and the chief academic officer side, because the technology people get it. But they're not winning the war all the time. You know, the people over in academia and, you know, the instructional technology and the curriculum people, when the day is done, they you know, use a lot of muscle. So that's boring to them in many instances, and they just want to have you guys in technology, like, you know, you go do that. That's your problem. They just want to get the right content. They're very content-centric. So the thing that I'm trying to do is do take that conversation down to simpler language, but put some drive behind it. And the drive that the Learning Council is using to get the academic side to understand is like, look, you know, it's really great that you got like all this incredible content, but let's talk about absorption of about user interface, tell you what that means, user experience, tell you what that means, because that's going to infer back to the interoperability thing, but more importantly, it's going to tell you content's no good unless it's accessible and designed for absorption via the screen. If it's complete in scope and sequence and beautiful, just like the old textbooks, there's a situation in the digital world that's similar to textbooks, which is almost no one ever used the whole textbook. If you have that in the digital world, you lose instructional time. Kids don't succeed, and it's a nightmare. So that brings the conversation home to the academic side to bring them into those discussions. And so that's kind of what I'm seeing needs to happen, is make it relevant to more people by speaking in their language. And that's kind of my mission right now.
Perfect.
And I completely agree, and I agree with both of you. I think we, as Lenny said, we need to demystify it, that those who are leading these efforts can't feel it's so complicated, that there needs to be a maturity model that they can evolve to. And I completely agree also with Leilani about communication, and I think part of the problem with this topic is perhaps even that we use the term interoperability, and the moment that, you know, most educators hear that, it's like, well, that's not my job, that's a technical problem. And so we need a language, we need a common language about how this solves learning, that, you know, and it can't just be the people who have technology in their title, their job. And the third point I'd make that is even those who are in charge of technology, and in most school districts, you know, there are many, many smaller school districts, many who don't have people with very much technical background. So we need to make sure that, you know, it isn't just happening in sophisticated districts like Houston, but that all districts, including the technology department, really see a roadmap of how to move up the food chain and demystify the conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, and as we're talking through this, you know, we've focused a lot on the school districts, but, you know, as I mentioned in my intro, interoperability really only works when you have all the players at the table really trying to work on that one goal. So from your perspective, what are the most important areas in this K-12 space where products need to work together? Keith?
Well, I think everything, that's an oversimplified area, but obviously anything that's using data, anything that, you know, it involves content, interoperability. So there's that increasingly as we get into more and more, you know, it's hard for me to identify what doesn't need that. We have too many siloed solutions where data and information and content can only be achieved by logging into that particular solution. And I think that you know, you're absolutely right. Everyone has to be at the table, and that's, you know, content providers and solution providers, and that also means they have to hear from a demand side, that school district purchasers need to demand, as you are doing in Houston, that we're just simply not going to buy things that don't do this. And if we use the power of the marketplace, the supplier side will solve it.
Agreed. Leilani, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think maybe I can go a little bit deeper into this relevancy on this because, you know, we've sort of broken down what is at the administrative layer for systems and pieces, and then what is at the learning, usually learning level layer for pieces. And so, you know, up at the administrative layer, you've got all those campus management systems, which includes your learning management system, your student information system. There's project-based learning management systems now. There's special needs systems, social emotional systems, teacher management systems, workflow management, coaching management, activity management, all these systems. And all of those are frameworks. They're ingesting data from all over the organization. Then you've got layers on top of that, which include your analytics dashboard layers, which plug and play, and they have to have interoperability into those other things in order to give the executives and instructional and academics feedback that's relevant so they can do something with it. And then you've got your security layers, your school and website portal layers. Single sign-on, like he said, is having a moment right now. Our survey shows that 30% of the market is currently shopping for single sign-on, which tells you they're ripening. They're coming to this party with interoperability in the next year, probably pretty hardcore in June. And then also at the administrative layer, you got virtualization, you got your web service and all your storage, and then down at the learning level, this is where things get wildly complex. You've got all your little baby applets percolating around with 75 logins per kid down at the teacher level. And then you've got your collections of content. Those are your big library systems with ebooks and other kinds of piecemeal content. Then you've got all your communications apps, which might sit outside your network, and then content, loose content, like I said, courseware, where the kid logs in and basically doesn't know anything about math and gets kicked out the other side knowing calculus in a few years. That's a whole nother thing because it's not a system normally like you think of a campus management system or learning management. It's whole pieces of courseware, and that stuff tends to sit outside this interoperability conversation a lot, and it really needs to come to the party. Then you've got all your creation and authorware stuff, your freelance online teachers that are out there. You've got learning gaming, which also is gearing up to do standards. The Learning Council is working on standards in learning gaming for output. You've got your online schools, like where do they sit in the game, and your portfolios, your student story building, your work lab software, testing, tool apps. You've got this whole universe that needs to be in this party. So this is education as a market is like the brain surgery level of interoperability. And it's going to have to be broken down very simply, step by step, with a way for everybody to play in it, because it's the only market that's dealing with all human knowledge. Like bankers don't deal with this level of complexity. The construction markets don't. Law enforcement doesn't. This market has a very big thing that they have to deal with. And it's not simple. And if we don't start making it more simple, we're never going to get the whole market to cross the bridge. It will be messy, and it will cause schools to go into sort of a non-relevancy because they can't keep up. So this is very. I know everybody on the call is very passionate about this, and we need to be, because it's only this amount of passion that's going to get the whole market to the other side of this, because it's that complicated.
Yeah, and the interesting thing that I found, and I think in HISD, it took us a while to embrace this perspective, is that there are a lot of what I will call false starts because this is so new, and this integration of all of the different pieces of content that you talked about into all the various subsystems, and then how people can access that data, because it's more than just getting them into a system. It's how is that data then represented out. This is a very iterative process, and I think people have to go into this with their eyes wide open, knowing that things aren't going to be perfect from the very beginning. that there is going to be this, we're going to test this, we think we know what we want, we're going to get it in the system, and then we have to come back and do it again. And then, you know, as content changes or as standards change, how does that affect how things are tagged within your system? So we're still very immature in just fundamentals of even maintaining interoperability once you get it into the system. And so, you know, one of the things that I often talk about with districts who are going down this is, you know, go in with your eyes wide open, because this is something that's iterative. You have to have everybody at the table, and you have to understand that there are going to be things that you're going to try that are not going to work, and you're going to have to come back to the table, or you're going to have to tweak them, and you have to be comfortable with that. And I think that's where you hear interoperability and the fact that it's very disruptive kind of being linked together. Keith, from what you're out seeing with the CIOs, what's your perspective on this term disruptive in the K-12 space? What are you seeing as far as interoperability and being disruptive?
Yeah, well, I think it will be very disruptive for any number of closed solutions that have locked up data and content. And so it will be a market disruptor. I think, and that is a good thing if it opens up and allows really much more personalization of learning. It allows districts to move things around, but it won't just happen naturally. And I think what I've observed, you know, well over the last decade is that there just hasn't been much movement, and I'm hoping that we are at an inflection moment where it really will. You know, Lenny and I spoke at the IMS Global conference this past April, I think it was, or May, and you know, I think the way we talk about this to the education community is critical, and one of the metaphors we used was, you know, in 1930, both washing machines and refrigerators were created, and by 1940, they both had achieved about 40% of the marketplace. But one of them, refrigerators, over the course of the next decade, jumped to 90% penetration. The other, the washing machine, it never has reached 90%. It peaked at about 1980. It took many more years. Well, why was that? It was because refrigerators were very easy. There was already a room for it. You plugged it in. There was electricity. It replaced maybe, you know, all it needed was electricity. Washing machines, there was no place in the house for it. It needed a separate room. It needed water. It needed a plumber. It needed an electrician. And I think part of the problem we have is we're expecting technology leaders in school districts to really take the ed tech washing machine, you know, and figure it all out, to find the new room, find the new plumbing, create, you know, be a carpenter, be a plumber, be an electrician. So perfect. I don't know, that was probably more vague than what you wanted, but.
No, that was good. Leilani, so, you know, when you think of disruption, that often will make people afraid, right? So there's risk, and when they hear something like, well, it's very disruptive, they're going to tend to back away. So how do we make people understand that this disruption is needed? It's not an option, and we make them not afraid of it, but willing to embrace this, because I think that's one of the barriers is disruption brings that fear factor in. So what can we do to take that away?
Well, a couple of things. First, I wanted to say, Keith, thanks for the analogy. That was really great, the washing machine analogy. I love that. So there's a couple of different things that we can do to have people welcome change. And I'm on my roadshow tour this year. We're going to do this. Hopefully, IMS Global is with me in a lot of cities like they were last year, giving the message, because we need that. But one of the things I'm doing is I'm going to be having little workshops within the day just to talk about new teacher roles. We're going to be sort of throwing out some of them we see emerging and why they're emerging, and then just let people talk about it, because I think we first have to bleed off the emotion nationally of change occurring in the first place, because like you're saying, people are afraid of change. And let people sort of like explore this. Can teachers work from home in their pajamas like all the software engineers in the universe do, and most of the bankers? Or, you know, do we always have to be in buildings? It's like, is there some upside on this whole, like, you know, churn that we're going through? And I think this is really going to be a good conversation, because it makes people less afraid of change if there's like a bunch of upsides for them. So, and there's a tremendous amount of potential for increased pay. There's definitely an increase in total number of employees according to our projections, and there's a lot of other good things. But, you know, just with regards to the leadership, I think the thing that we're also advocating for is that change is only scary if you have a very narrow attention span. If your attention span is on who you are now and what you've been doing and your immediate front door and the people in that building, you can't deal with change, because the number one thing you have to do is widen your attention span. That's why I go around the country talking about the consumerization of learning. I'm trying to bring context to what's happening on the national and international economic scene. What is driving humans right now? Why is Amazon crushing it in the retail sector? Why do young people want the tiny house and no mortgage? Because they're after experience. The whole economy and the more progressive countries are after, as a pinnacle driving things, experience in life. You know, for the last couple hundred years, we've had to go somewhere every day. For thousands of years before that, people were, you know, families huddled around a farm. They barely ever went very far. And now for a couple hundred years, we've been scurrying to and fro everywhere, every day, constantly. I think mankind is exhausted. And so you look at these younger populations and they're like, hey, you know what, I'd be really great if I didn't have to, you know, be a slave to a mortgage my entire life. That'd be awesome. So I'd like to go to Disneyland and maybe France, and, you know, I'm going to focus on experience. So if you bring that into the educational scene and say, look, as a wider view, you should be, as a school, an experiential hub. Here's how you're going to leverage yourself with technology. But your end goal is becoming the Disneyland of learning. Can you do that? Can you get on board with that? This is going to be exciting. Change is going to be cool. And I think that's part of the way that we get people on board with it, is we tell them, you know, look how cool this is going to be, how leveraged you're going to be, how validated you're going to be for who you are as a teacher or administrator, because you're providing something so relevant that people want and need. So anyway, so that's sort of my address to it. I hope I didn't say too much there.
No. I think this is a really important conversation, because, you know, I think it's the demystification that we talked about earlier. It's the fear of disruption. It's the pressure for, you know, teachers to get the standards and the state testing and everything else, get their kids passing all of that. And, you know, it's kind of like that Stephen Covey, you know, sharpening the saw. At some point, you have to stop cutting the tree down and sharpen that saw. And that's kind of the way that I'm looking at interoperability. Is, yes, it's going to be disruptive, and, you know, it's going to cause teachers to think about things differently, and maybe they won't be able to do lesson plans as quick, but the lessons that they will be providing to their systems or to their students are going to be so much more impactful that it's this tipping point that we've got to take advantage of. When we look at content providers and the vendors out there, the learning management systems and the SIS systems, you know, for years we had been talking about this digitization of content and how important it was, and that train was coming. And I think for many years people would shake their head to that and really never think that it was going to come to fruition. Now that we're seeing, you know, districts and states embracing this, what kind of things are you seeing? Let's start with content providers. What kind of things are you seeing from content providers that really show you that they're embracing this whole digitization of content and interoperability? Leilani, why don't we start with you?
Well, first of all, you've got recently the National Science Foundation granted a grant to create a framework for outcomes from learning games. So that can be standard in learning games. So if you look at what's going on with content, there's a dividing line, a little war zone that's emerged in the market between what is a framework system where you're sticking in chunks of content, video being a chunk, scrap of an old textbook scanned in as a chunk, a paragraph from something else as a chunk, and you're having your teacher scope and sequence that together. That's the framework side. And then the other side is stuff that's fully loaded. You log in, it's pre-testing you, it's putting you through an animated sort of game-like world of lesson after lesson after lesson. As an individual child, you get an individual pathway, you're cruising along, you get that one right, boom, you go to the next level, you get another one, or that it keeps shooting questions at you until you do pass, right? So that's the kind of Courseware world that I see emerging. That's what the consumers are buying now. That's why ABC Mouse has $1 billion market cap. And they're going all the way to K-12, by the way, in their build this year. So what's emerging is there's two separate worlds, and the Courseware world doesn't have as decent of a feedback loop. It scares teachers because they're afraid they're pushed out of the framework. But a lot of it is actually built with teacher levering. So you can gate this child forward or pull them back. You can go back and unravel them from not passing in something and basically apply real skill from teaching that's needed, because machines will be not totally, they'll be infallible in this, like they'll make mistakes. And so you're leveraging your teacher more. But those are the worlds that are emerging. So when I look at Courseware, I'm looking at the failure in the past of online and distance learning was entirely a UI, UX issue, poorly designed, couldn't find your way, navigational issues. So now the stuff that's emerging from the software field is bang on. It's amazing. And it's applying not only a skill with user interface, user design and user experience, but it's also going beyond that into actual new technologies of how a human being learns audially and visually, which is thrilling. What's missing now in the conversation that I think is really important about Courseware is how do we make teachers more human? So we get past this decade or two of, killing the teachers with testing, scramble on the standards, blah, 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 and we give them the best stuff, and we leverage them, and we roll them back into the greatest skill they really have, which is one-on-one, right? This is the miracle that should have been all along. Of course, it took a while for technology to get there, and it's still not there on every subject and every grade, but it is getting there quickly. And the amount of money pouring into this is amazing to me. But the teachers have to be taught that this is a leverage of them. And if they're not taught that, they're scared of it.
Perfect. Yeah. Keith, speaking of, an awareness and money pouring in, you've seen a heightened awareness with interoperability with some of the big K-12 foundations and their understanding the relevance and importance of this. Can you talk about some of the work that's going on there?
Yeah, very much. I think particularly the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation have put down a very clear marker. They've had a long interest in data and making sure that educators have access to that. They've realized that interoperability is a major impediment to getting to their vision of what the future is, and they are funding a variety of different efforts, one of which is Project Unicorn, which CoSN is part of. They are also bringing together other foundations and trying to really drive this interoperability effort, I think both from the demand side, working with organizations like IMS as well as the Ed-Fi Alliance, which they started. So I think that is very new and very much, I would say, in the last 12 to 15 months, something that's very different.
Yeah, exactly. And I think purely from a district perspective, it's exciting to see all these new players coming in, but it's also somewhat nerve-wracking because my biggest fear with all of these players coming in, understanding the relevance of interoperability, is that there's different messaging and there's different definitions of interoperability, and there's multiple roadmaps for interoperability. And so I think one of the things that is going to be really important as these organizations come together is that, as we spoke about earlier in this webinar, is that we coalesce around what is interoperability. We coalesce around the vision and a roadmap, and that we all are working from one play sheet, because I think it becomes very dangerous, and I think it will slow the adoption down if we have multiple pathways to try and get this done, and multiple perspectives of what this looks like. I think that muddies the water and it'll slow us down. So, you know, I know CoSN and Leilani, I know you guys are working on trying to make sure that we're all coalescing around a vision.
I'm very much behind IMS Global on this. And I know there's other organizations that are starting doing things, but I agree with you. Dispersal of attention on this issue is bad. And because, quite frankly, what I'd like to see the big foundations doing the most of is creating a pool of money for the smallest development and the smallest companies that come into play that maybe can't afford all this extra development for interoperability, and help them get to market that way. Because otherwise what's really going to happen is you have a choke. The companies that can afford to be fully interoperability can play. And everyone else won't be play, which may actually inhibit the market from getting the best stuff. So I'm much more in the foundation. Stop worrying about this. IMS Global's got to cover it. Go worry about something else, which this is the issue. It's the smaller companies who need development help.
Completely agree. Completely agree. So I know we want to leave time for some Q&A. So I have one question that I want to pose to each of you. If you were in a room full of CIOs from the K-12 space that were all very interested in interoperability, but they fit into that definition that we talked about. They think it's this mammoth thing. They're afraid of the risk. What would you tell them? What advice would you give them? Leilani, we'll start with you.
I'd say go make friends with Lenny.
Yeah, I'm a nice guy. I really am.
Yeah, he's a really nice guy. Super busy, but you make friends. I would say, like, listen, just join. Like, go to IMS Global, get part of this game, because, you know, you have to start somewhere. You know, it's like, first, accept the overwhelm, but then take your first step. The only way to handle the confusion is take on one data point at a time. And if you just have this one data point, which is, you know, IMS Global will help you solve this, just do it, right? Because that's the only way to start down the path. And I'm really excited for the future, because I think the issues are being solved. Somebody has stepped into this breach, and there's a continuum in my mind of how this is going to go. And so that's the first thing. Just take the first step.
Perfect. Thanks. Keith?
Well, one of the things that I would do is to go read CoSN's free interoperability standards primer, which is a first way to kind of orient yourself on the different aspects of it. But I think there are a number of things that are starting to happen. As Lenny said, and CoSN is, I think we'll have more things to report over the next few months, the first quarter of 2018, with organizations like Project Unicorn, that I think will help provide a more maturity model and a clearer sense of what people can do.
Perfect. And the one thing that I've said since I've been in K-12, and I started in K-12 in 2003, is that, especially from the technology perspective, we love to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And what I always tell my peers is, the best thing you do is reach out to people who are doing it. Find those districts, find those leaders, and just talk to them. Steal everything that you can from them, just to become a sponge, because that's where you really learn it all. And if you can establish those relationships, then they become the great ally. And you have organizations like CoSN, you have organizations like IMS, you have organizations that are willing to help you, and I think it's just a matter of joining them, and then, don't be afraid to ask questions. So, Jill, I think we're at that point for some questions, so I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for a great conversation. We want to say once again to our attendees, if you do have a question, please feel free to enter it through the Q&A. we'll be glad to take questions from our audience. And in the meantime, here's a question for you. How will we know when we've reached success milestones, and what would those milestones look like? That could be for any of you.
I think Lenny's the most qualified to answer that. I would answer from a little bit more esoteric viewpoint.
Well, I agree. I'd like to hear from Houston what does that look like?
Well, I think it's a matter of, again, breaking it down into bite-sized chunks. So, you know, if you were starting out on this, you know, I think the simplest thing to look at is single sign-on. You know, and do we have the ability to leverage that piece of technology throughout the district for our apps? And are we willing to draw a line in the sand that says you either have this embedded in your application or, you know, we're not using you? So, you know, it's really difficult for me to say what it would be unless I knew what your roadmap is. You know, I think for the integration of technology, for me, success is when I have the platform vendor, when I have the content provider sitting in a room and we're actually talking about what the ingestion of the content will be and how it will look in our system, how our system will take it, how it will store it, and then how it's being displayed out, and then having those iterative conversations to say, you know what, this cartridge isn't providing the content in a meaningful way for our teachers. Leilani, you talked about it earlier that it's more than just getting the content into systems. You have to make it easily accessible by teachers. And if it's not, then they're not going to come back and use this. So, you know, it's that iterative process. I think it's understanding what your current state is and then defining those milestone pieces that will show you whether you're making them or not. And you can, again, you can start out with single sign-on, and then you can go all the way up to the common cartridge ingestion, the LTI integration. But I think if I were to say that the biggest thing that you look for is the district has to draw their line in the sand as far as what they're willing to tolerate and what they're not willing to tolerate. And until they do that, it's very easy for people to be able to move around what you're considering to be a standard.
Great. So it sounds like making the commitment is really the first step.
It's making the commitment and then understanding what your roadmap is, right? And not trying to be too aggressive and be unrealistic in this, because this is a cultural changing initiative, right? You have to have curriculum at the table with you. You have to have principals at the table with you. You have to have your professional development team at the table with you. So this changes the way people think about content, the way they think about creating a lesson plan. So it's culturally changing. So pacing of this is critical. So this isn't something you decide January 1st that you're going to start doing and have 100% adoption for school year 2018, right? And that's why we keep talking, and I think all three of us are harping on this roadmap, that you have to understand what the roadmap is, you have to understand what your current state is, and then you have to set a realistic expectation and pacing path forward.
Absolutely, agreed. So let me ask just one other question. And you've referenced how important it is that across departmental conversations, or perhaps we could say it as the superintendent cabinet level conversations that need to take place. If you were going to think about one particular conversation or topic that you felt like a CTO and a CAO needed to have to get this conversation started around interoperability, what would that be?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm telling people. I'm putting those senior executives in a position to understand that they are competing with direct global consumerization of learning. And they need to up their game in order to stay relevant. It's not just a matter of let's retool internally because we're being cute and doing super duper stuff with machines. In an isolated island of niceness. I'm bringing to bear the full force of the market when I talk to people. And I think that that's really an incentive to change because it's real. The numbers show that it's real. And so, if you want people to move, you got to show them the boogeyman. And there is a boogeyman. And it's like I'm saying, it's the direct consumerization of learning. Some people, when I first start talking about it, they don't really believe it. I just use the word Amazon. And I've had school districts now in several cities, like this one guy, I forget what city that was, I think it was San Diego, he stood up and he said, so you're telling me education has to Amazon up? And I'm like, yep, I'm going to quote you on that, which we did. We did a story on him about that. So that's really where I say that's what you bring up. And it's working for us, city by city, to show people that. And it's causing change. We can see it. Because next year when we go back to the same city, I've had people run up to me and go, thanks for getting me my job. I'm now the new head of, digital instructional technology. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is if you look at a lot of the mission statements or vision statements in K-12 space, you're starting to see this undertone of a global graduate, right? We want to have kids that are globally aware and can globally compete. And I think it takes sitting down and really breaking down what does that mean, right? If we're saying this, then the way we have taught for the last 30 years isn't going to create a global graduate, right? And giving them a device isn't the magic bullet that makes them a global graduate. So what is it that's going to make them a global graduate? And I think it's breaking that down so that each area, particularly the curriculum and instruction departments, understand what that looks like. And then it's going a step further to break it down to say, okay, what is your role in making this actually happen? And how do these departments then have to come together? How do we think about procurement of resources differently? How do we think of funding differently? What are we going to stop doing? Because we're spending a hell of a lot of money on things that really aren't going to provide or produce a global graduate. So when I think in terms of who is the conversation that needs to happen, yes, the academic officer is very important, but it's the cabinet as a whole really sitting down and having hard conversations about what it's going to mean from the district perspective to create this global graduate, and what are we going to change within the multiple departments that have to happen in order for this graduate to come to place. That's what we've done in HISD, and so I think that's why it's become such a systemic part of how we operate, where it's not even a conversation anymore. But we're 4 years into that, and so when I talk about this being a culturally changing initiative, that's what I mean is, you have to have multiple people thinking completely different than they have for the past 20 or 30 years.
Fantastic. Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to, I'll just add a little coda. I completely agree with all of that. And we've got, my advice would be to avoid technogeek terms about interoperability and talk about what learning and skills, as Lenny is saying, what does that look like? And being clear that it's not there are technical things behind it, but we're leaving out all the key people who need to be part of the conversation because they don't understand why it's critical for learning and preparing students for the world.
Well, great. I want to just say thank you again to our guest speakers today for an invigorating conversation. We really appreciate your being here and sharing your vision and your expertise with all of us. And as we wrap up, IMS members from the 50 school districts, including half of the top 10 largest school districts and representation from 45 U.S. state departments and over 180 leading K-12 suppliers. Our collaborative is leading the effort to rapidly advance an educational technology ecosystem where students and teachers have better options for digital tools that work together and result in more effective teaching and learning. You can see some of the logos represented here. Our innovative leadership networks work together to produce resources of benefit to the entire K-12 community, and you can access these resources at imsglobal.org/K12. In particular, we want to point out that there are case studies and articles and videos that are of help to districts of all sizes to begin this transition to a fully integrated ecosystem. Procurement resources are available and checklists that help districts with procuring digital platforms and apps and tools, so be sure to check it out. Ensuring that your educational technology tools are IMS Globally certified is the best way to establish a plug-and-play ecosystem that allows all of your tools and content to work together. If you're just starting out, you should review some of the resources IMS Global has developed to help you know what to ask for from your vendors and what to include in RFPs. IMS Global offers assistance to our members who need help and guidance determining their needs. The IMS Global Certified Product Directory contains the official listing of products that have passed IMS Global Interoperability testing and certification. Visit the product directory to see all of the certified products. And join us for the next webinar, the first of our 2018 series, IMS Global's Digital Learning Revolution program, Making the Commitment. Registration is open already, so we hope you'll sign up now. Please check out valuable resources on the IMS Global website and our K-12 playbook that are related to today's webinar. And in addition, we want to encourage you to check out resources from CoSN and Leilani Kaufman's book, The Consumerization of Learning, as well. So, action items for our attendees. We'll ask you to check out all of the related resources from IMS Global, CoSN, and the Learning Council, and you'll be able to access these from the webinar detail page. Within about 24 hours, you'll be able to get to the recording of today's webinar, and then we would encourage you to go ahead and register for the next webinar in January. Thank you very much for everybody for attending. Have a great afternoon.